The little girl looked up at the stranger reading her favorite bedtime story and asked the one question that brought the entire library to a standstill. Are you really my daddy? 5 years earlier, he had walked away from the woman he loved after refusing to believe she was carrying his twin daughters. Now the children he had never held were standing right in front of him. But before they could ever become a family, he would have to prove that some mistakes can be redeemed and that a broken father can still learn how to love. Every conversation stopped. Parents turned from the books in their hands. Even the librarian behind the checkout desk froze with a scanner still hovering over an unfinished stack of novels. All muscles in Daniel Carter's body stiffened up as he faced the gaze of the little girl who awaited the response only one person in the room knew the answer to. Before Daniel Carter could reply, a woman's shaky voice interrupted the silence. Emma. Slowly, Daniel lifted his head and saw the woman he had been trying to forget about over 6 long years. Nothing about her had changed. Her chestnut hair had grown longer, and she was carrying the weariness of a single mother. And instead of the spark of energy in her hazel eyes, there was caution in her look. But she was still her, the woman he had loved enough to spend eternity with, and who had broken his heart. She quickly approached the little girl, lightly putting her hands on her shoulders. Sweetheart, why don't you let Mr. Carter finish the story for everyone? Emma frowned. But Mama, he looks just like the man in your old photo. Daniel's heartbeat stumbled. Olivia's expression changed for only a second, but it was enough. Fear, not anger. Fear. She quickly forced a smile for her daughter. Sometimes people just look alike. Emma wasn't convinced. She looked back at Daniel with wide blue eyes that seemed impossibly familiar. Eyes he'd seen every morning whenever he looked in a mirror. Are you sure? She whispered. Daniel couldn't breathe. The little girl's smile, the slight tilt of her head, even the tiny birthmark beside her left eyebrow. They weren't just familiar. They belonged to him. Somewhere deep inside, a truth he'd buried years ago clawed its way back to life. When story time ended, parents thanked Daniel before gathering their children. He barely heard any of them. His entire world had narrowed to one woman collecting picture books into a canvas tote while gently buttoning a little girl's pink jacket. He wanted to walk away. He should have walked away. 6 years ago, he'd made his choice. But his feet refused to move. Olivia finally looked up. Their eyes met across the nearly empty children's section. Neither of them smiled. Neither of them knew where to begin. Daniel took one slow step forward. Olivia. Her shoulders stiffened. Don't. Just one word. Quiet. Firm. Final. Please, Daniel said. I didn't come here looking for you. I know. She zipped Emma's coat without looking at him. This library is public. There was an awkward silence before Emma tugged on Olivia's sleeve. Mama, can we borrow the bear book too? Olivia nodded. Go ask Mrs. Sanders if it's available. The little girl happily skipped toward the librarian, leaving them alone for the first time in 6 years. Daniel swallowed hard. She's. He couldn't finish the sentence. Olivia finally met his eyes. Yes. The single word landed like thunder inside his chest. Daniel felt the room tilt. She's mine. Olivia closed her eyes for a moment before answering. I never wanted to keep that from you. His breathing became uneven. Then why? Her laugh held no joy. Because you made it very clear you wanted nothing to do with us. The accusation struck harder because he remembered every ugly word he'd spoken. 6 years earlier, she'd stood in his apartment holding a positive pregnancy test with trembling hands. Instead of embracing her, he'd accused her of lying. Instead of believing the woman he loved, he believed his older brother, who insisted Olivia was only interested in Daniel after his software company sold for nearly $80 million. His brother had called it the oldest trick in the world. She wants your money. Daniel had listened. Olivia had cried. And before morning break, she had left with just a suitcase and the baby inside her womb. I was looking for you, Daniel muttered. For how long? Olivia appeared genuinely surprised. For 3 weeks. I waited for almost a year, she added. Those words tore into pieces something in him. He had spent so many years telling himself that she had left him because she never wanted him to be a part of her life. And now he found out that she had actually waited for almost a year for him to come knocking at her door. Emma rushed back, holding 2 books close to her body. "Mama, Mrs. Sanders says I can borrow them both." She gave a smile at Daniel. "Bye, Mr. Story Reader." Daniel managed to give a smile. "Bye, Emma." And then, to Daniel's surprise, the little girl rushed to him and hugged him tightly before running away. Daniel remained frozen. He had never touched his daughter in all those years. But then she had hugged him without giving it a second thought. When Olivia reached the door, she stopped for a moment without turning around. "If you really want answers," she said quietly, "stop looking for someone to blame and start remembering the man you used to be." Then she walked into the falling snow, her daughter happily swinging the library books beside her, leaving Daniel standing alone among shelves filled with stories. Realizing the most important story of his life had been waiting 6 years for him to finally read. Daniel didn't remember driving home. One moment he was standing in the children's section of the Maple Grove Public Library, staring at the snow-covered sidewalk where Olivia and Emma had disappeared, and the next he was sitting inside the underground parking garage of his downtown apartment building with the engine still running. The silence inside the car felt heavier than any boardroom he'd ever walked into. He rested both hands on the steering wheel and closed his eyes, but instead of darkness, all he saw was a little girl with blue eyes asking, "Are you really my daddy?" The question echoed through every corner of his mind until it became impossible to escape. 6 years. He had lost 6 years because he'd chosen suspicion over trust. His phone vibrated against the center console, flashing the name of his older brother, Michael Carter. Daniel stared at it until the ringing stopped. A second later, another call came. This time he answered. "Where the hell are you?" Michael asked without greeting. "The investors have been waiting 40 minutes. Daniel leaned back against the seat. "Cancel it." There was silence. "What?" "Cancel the meeting." Michael laughed. "Since when do you skip meetings worth $50 million? Daniel looked through the windshield at the falling snow. "Since I found out I have a daughter." The line went completely silent. When Michael finally spoke, his voice was lower. "What are you talking about?" "Olivia." Daniel's jaw tightened. "She had the baby." "Daniel, you told me she was lying." Michael sighed impatiently. "We went through this years ago." "No," Daniel interrupted. "You went through it. I just believed you." Another long silence followed before Michael spoke again. "You don't know that child is yours." Daniel's hands curled into fists. "I know. Did you get a DNA test?" I looked into her eyes. Michael scoffed. "That's not evidence." Daniel's voice hardened. "Maybe not in court, but it's enough for me." Without another word, he ended the call and turned off his phone completely. For the first time since selling Carter Technologies, he didn't care about shareholders, contracts, or quarterly reports. None of it mattered anymore. Back inside his apartment, everything suddenly felt cold. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Chicago skyline. Expensive artwork covered the walls, and every piece of furniture had been chosen by an interior designer. It was exactly the kind of home magazines called perfect. Yet standing in the middle of it, Daniel realized no child had ever laughed here. No bedtime stories had ever been read. No tiny shoes had ever been left by the front door. It wasn't a home. It was a showroom. His eyes drifted toward a storage cabinet he hadn't opened in years. He stood up after several minutes and came over to pull out a cardboard box covered with dust, which was marked personal. It held the remnants of his past. Concert tickets, vacation photos, birthday cards. And at the bottom was a velvet box. He opened it and found his engagement ring right where he had placed it 6 years ago. He had purchased it just 3 days before his life had collapsed and was going to present it to Olivia during his visit to Lake Geneva. But the visit became the most miserable night of their life. Daniel sat on the floor and stared at the ring in his hand while the tears began to fill his eyes. Just then there was a knock at the door. "Mr. Carter?" It was Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, the 68-year-old housekeeper who had been serving Daniel's family since Daniel was a college student. She came in using her key to unlock the door of his apartment. "Michael told me that you didn't seem well." Daniel wiped his tears away hurriedly, but Evelyn had known him too long to be deceived. Something must have happened, she said softly. Daniel nodded once. I met my daughter today. Evelyn froze. Olivia's child? Daniel looked up in surprise. You knew? She lowered herself onto the sofa with a weary sigh. Your mother knew too? Daniel stared at her, as if she'd spoken another language. What did you just say? Evelyn looked away. Olivia came to the house once. About 2 months after she left, Daniel felt the room spin. She came here. She wanted to see you. Why didn't anyone tell me? Evelyn's eyes filled with regret. Because your mother refused to let her inside. Daniel shot to his feet. What? Evelyn clasped her trembling hands together. Your mother believed Michael. She said if Olivia really loved you, she'd leave quietly instead of causing trouble. Olivia stood outside in the rain for nearly 20 minutes. Daniel could barely breathe. She wasn't asking for money, Evelyn whispered. She was asking for you. The words hit harder than anything he'd heard all day. She left a letter. Daniel's heart pounded. A letter. Evelyn nodded slowly. Your mother burned it in the fireplace after Olivia walked away. Daniel stood completely still. Every memory he'd spent 6 years clinging to suddenly collapsed beneath him. Olivia hadn't disappeared. She hadn't given up. She had come back one last time. And someone had made sure he would never know. He turned toward the massive windows overlooking the city, his reflection staring back like a stranger. For 6 years, he had blamed the wrong person. The woman he loved had never stopped trying to reach him. Someone else had decided his future for him. And as Daniel closed his hand around the untouched engagement ring, one truth became painfully clear. Finding Olivia and Emma would be difficult. But discovering who had stolen 6 years from all 3 of them was going to change his family forever. Daniel didn't sleep that night. The untouched engagement ring remained on the kitchen counter beside the cold cup of coffee he'd forgotten to drink, while Evelyn's confession echoed through every room of the penthouse. Olivia had come back. She had stood outside his parents' mansion carrying his unborn child, hoping for one final chance to speak to him. And someone had stolen that chance before he ever knew it existed. By sunrise, Daniel had reached one conclusion that refused to leave his mind. Before he could ask Olivia for forgiveness, he needed the truth. Not the version his family had spent 6 years protecting, but the truth buried beneath pride, money, and lies. He grabbed his coat and drove straight to Carter Manor, the sprawling estate overlooking Lake Michigan where he'd grown up believing family always protected each other. Today, it looked less like a home and more like a fortress built to hide secrets. The gates opened automatically when security recognized his car. Inside, gardeners trimmed snow-covered hedges while staff hurried between the main house and guest wing, preparing for the annual Carter Foundation New Year's luncheon. Everything was perfect in every possible way. Daniel parked his car close to the main door and walked straight in without knocking. His mother, Victoria Carter, was there in the elegant foyer supervising decorators who were installing crystal chandeliers which shone on the marble floor. At 66 years old, she was always perfect and impeccable. Her figure was graceful, wearing a perfectly tailored cream suit that seemed more appropriate on a cover page than for the occasion. She greeted her son smilingly as soon as she saw him. Daniel, I thought you would come tomorrow. He did not smile back at her. We need to talk. The sound in his voice forced the decorators to leave quietly. What's wrong? Daniel fished into his pocket and put down the engagement ring on the marble table between them. Do you remember this? Her face brightened up. This ring you have bought for Olivia? Why didn't you tell me she came here? Victoria's smile disappeared. She didn't answer. Daniel took one slow step closer. Evelyn told me everything. A flicker of irritation crossed his mother's face before she carefully composed herself again. She should have kept her opinions to herself. They weren't opinions. Daniel's jaw tightened. She said Olivia came here while she was pregnant. Victoria folded her arms. She did. And you sent her away. I protected you. Daniel stared at his mother as though he'd never seen her before. Protected me? That girl arrived here demanding to see you after you'd made it clear the relationship was over. Daniel's voice rose for the first time. I never made that clear. You walked away from her. Because Michael convinced me she was lying. Victoria's eyes hardened. Your brother was trying to protect the company. A scandal involving an unexpected pregnancy would have damaged the merger. Daniel felt sick. You cared more about stock prices than your grandchild. Watch your tone. No. He shook his head. Not anymore. For years he'd obeyed every expectation. The perfect son. The responsible executive. The heir who never embarrassed the Carter name. Standing there now, he realized that every decision had been made for appearances instead of love. Did she ask for money? Daniel asked quietly. Victoria hesitated. No. Did she threaten us? No. Then why? His mother looked away toward the snow-covered gardens outside the window. Because she wanted you. The answer hung in the silence. Daniel waited. Finally, she continued. She believed you would choose her over your future. Over the company. Over everything your father spent 40 years building. Daniel laughed once, but there was no humor in it. You mean she believed I'd choose the woman I loved? Victoria's voice sharpened. Love doesn't keep thousands of employees working. Love doesn't preserve family legacies. Daniel looked at her with quiet disbelief. No, but love raises children. His mother's shoulders stiffened. For the first time in his life, neither of them spoke. The silence was broken by footsteps echoing across the foyer. Michael Carter entered carrying a leather briefcase, stopping abruptly when he noticed the tension between them. What's going on? He asked. Daniel slowly turned toward his older brother. Did you know Olivia came here? Michael didn't answer immediately. That was answer enough. I asked you a question. Michael sighed heavily. Yes. Daniel felt his pulse hammering in his ears. And you let me believe she disappeared? Michael placed the briefcase on a chair. Daniel, you weren't thinking clearly back then. Answer the question. Yes. The single word hit harder than a punch. She begged to see you. Michael admitted quietly. Mom asked me to handle it. Daniel's hands curled into fists. Handle it how? Michael looked him straight in the eye. I told her if she truly loved you, she'd stop destroying your future and leave. Daniel stood frozen. All the memories he'd spent years playing out finally made sense. Olivia didn't leave him behind. She was driven away by the very people whom he trusted most. And as Michael casually tugged at his cufflinks as if making a business arrangement, Daniel understood that the biggest act of betrayal of his entire life wasn't perpetrated by the girl whom he loved. It was betrayed by his family. Daniel couldn't breathe. All the memories he had held on to for 6 years crashed down around him in the middle of the perfect foyer of his parents. Olivia didn't run off. She didn't deliberately make herself forget him. She sought him out, holding their baby in her arms, hoping that once she would look at him, everything could be fixed. Instead, the people whom he trusted most were the ones who blocked the way and changed the course of all their lives forever. How could you do that? Daniel asked, his voice sounding too calm. Michael rubbed the bridge of his nose, as though exhausted by a conversation he didn't want to have. Because someone had to think logically. You were prepared to throw away everything Dad built for a woman you'd known for 3 years. Daniel laughed bitterly. 3 years? You make it sound like she was some stranger. She wasn't one of us, Victoria interrupted firmly. She never understood the responsibilities that come with this family. No, Daniel replied, locking eyes with his mother. She understood something this family never did. Victoria frowned. What does that mean? Daniel's voice cracked with restrained emotion. She understood loyalty. The words echoed through the marble foyer. Michael stepped forward, lowering his voice. Daniel, listen to yourself. Everything worked out. You became CEO. The company doubled in value. We protected your future. Daniel slowly shook his head. Protected? His eyes burned with disbelief. While I was celebrating promotions and signing contracts, Olivia was giving birth alone. Neither of them answered. While I was buying penthouses and flying to London for board meetings, my daughter learned to walk without me. Silence. While I convinced myself she betrayed me, she was raising our child believing I'd abandoned them. Victoria finally spoke, her voice softer now. We truly believed it was the best decision. Daniel stared at her for several seconds before quietly asking, "Have you ever spent one single day wondering what Emma's first word was?" His mother's expression faltered. "Do you know what her favorite toy was?" More silence. "Do you know what she looked like the first time she smiled?" Victoria lowered her eyes. Daniel swallowed hard. "I don't either." His voice broke completely. "Because you stole all of it from me." The weight of those words settled over the room like concrete. Even Michael looked away. Daniel reached into his coat pocket and removed the faded ultrasound photograph Evelyn had secretly given him the previous evening. He carefully unfolded it before placing it on the console table beside the engagement ring. "I've spent 6 years believing this child wasn't real." His fingertips rested gently against the image. "Now it's the most valuable thing I own." Victoria reached toward the photograph, but Daniel quietly picked it back up before she could touch it. "Don't." The single word stopped her cold. For the first time in his life, she looked genuinely afraid of losing her son. "Daniel," she whispered, "I know you're angry." "Angry?" He smiled sadly. "I'm grieving." He looked around the mansion that had once represented security and success. Suddenly it felt empty. Every priceless painting, every antique chandelier, every polished surface seemed meaningless compared to one little girl who probably preferred finger paints and stuffed animals. "Do you know what hurts the most?" he asked quietly. "It's not that you lied." He looked directly at Michael. "It's that every Christmas, every birthday, every family dinner, you all knew there was another little girl who should have been sitting at our table." No one spoke. No, they couldn't. "You denied Emma her grandparents." Daniel's voice was more confident with each sentence. "You denied my father the opportunity to meet his granddaughter before he passed away. You denied me bedtime stories, scraped knees, first words, first birthdays." He stopped, not able to say anything else for some time. "And you denied Olivia the one man who promised that he would never let her go." Tears were rolling down Victoria's face. "I was sure that time would help you forget." Daniel looked at her with heartbreaking sorrow. "True love does not fade with time." He put the ultrasound back into his wallet. "It only waits." Without saying anything more, he took the engagement ring from the table and put it into his mother's shaking hands. "Take it," he said softly. "It belongs to the version of me you wanted." He moved towards the front door. This man is leaving the house to have nothing more to do with Carter heritage. Michael finally managed to speak. "Where are you going?" "To earn the right to be Emma's father." Then he walked out of Carter Manor, leaving behind the mansion, the fortune, and the expectations that had defined his entire life. For the first time in years, he wasn't chasing success. He was chasing redemption. And no matter how long it took, no matter how many doors closed in his face, he would spend the rest of his life proving to Olivia and the little girl he'd never stopped loving that this time he would never walk away again. The first thing Daniel did after leaving Carter Manor was call the board of Carter Technologies. By noon, every executive had gathered in the glass conference room overlooking downtown Chicago, expecting another quarterly strategy meeting. Instead, Daniel walked in wearing the same wrinkled clothes he'd worn since the previous day, carrying no laptop, no presentation, and no carefully prepared financial reports. The room fell silent as he stood at the head of the table. "I'm taking an indefinite leave of absence as CEO," he announced. Shock rippled across the room. Several directors exchanged confused glances while the company's legal counsel immediately opened a notebook. "Mr. Carter," one board member began cautiously, "is this because of the merger?" Daniel shook his head. "No, it's because I've spent 6 years building the wrong life." No one knew how to respond. They had seen Daniel negotiate billion-dollar contracts without raising his voice. They had watched him outmaneuver competitors twice his age. But the man standing before them now looked exhausted, humbled, and strangely peaceful. "The company is profitable," Daniel continued. "The leadership team knows what to do without me. My absence won't destroy Carter Technologies. But staying here will destroy what's left of my chance to become the father my daughter deserves." Murmurs spread around the table. Most of them had no idea Daniel even had a child. He signed the leave documents without hesitation, slid them toward the chairman. and quietly walked out before anyone could persuade him otherwise. For the first time since he was 24 years old, he wasn't carrying the weight of an empire on his shoulders. He was carrying something far heavier, the responsibility of earning forgiveness. 3 days later, Daniel rented a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Maple Grove, only 15 minutes from the public library where he'd seen Emma. It was a world away from his penthouse. The floors creaked, the kitchen was barely large enough for 2 people, and the bedroom windows overlooked a neighborhood park instead of Chicago's skyline. Yet when he unpacked a single suitcase and placed the framed photograph of Emma that the librarian had reluctantly printed from the library's community newsletter on the bookshelf, the apartment felt warmer than any place he'd ever lived. He deliberately chose not to contact Olivia. Jessica, the librarian, had made one thing painfully clear after Daniel returned to ask about volunteer opportunities. If you really mean what you said, she'd told him, stop chasing Olivia. Let your actions speak louder than your apologies. The statement stuck with him. He stopped looking for Olivia and started searching for ways to be worthy of seeing his daughter again. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, he volunteered at the library, fixing old children's books, planning reading sessions, and assisting shy kids pick up books. During the weekends, he used to read for the children, making fun sounds which made the toddlers roar with laughter. Initially, the kids would treat him as one of the volunteers, but then slowly they started waiting for him. Mr. Daniel, they would shout as soon as he came in. Little hands would rush to reach out to him before he could place his backpack anywhere. The parents would thank him for making scared kids interested in reading. The small moments filled the void in him that all his professional success couldn't. It was a rainy day when he was assisting the repainting of the mural in the kids' reading area that an old man came up to him with a pile of novels. "You're Daniel Carter, aren't you?" the man asked. Daniel smiled politely. "I used to be." The old man chuckled. "People don't stop being themselves just because they leave a job." Daniel accepted the books and shrugged. "Maybe they can if they're trying hard enough." The man nodded thoughtfully before pointing toward the colorful mural. "You know, my wife always said character isn't measured by how people behave when everyone's watching. It's measured by what they choose to do when nobody expects anything from them." Daniel thought about those words long after the man left. Nobody expected him to spend afternoons scrubbing paintbrushes or repairing torn picture books. Nobody would put it in the newspapers or congratulate him at shareholder meetings. For the first time in his adult life, he was doing something that earned no applause, and somehow it mattered more than every award hanging in his former office. Weeks turned into months. Winter slowly surrendered to spring. The snow melted into green parks where children chased butterflies and flew colorful kites beneath clear blue skies. Daniel built a quiet routine: therapy every Monday morning, library volunteer work 4 days a week, parenting classes on Wednesday evenings. Every night before bed, he wrote one letter to Emma in a leather journal he kept locked inside his bedside drawer. He wrote about the stories he'd read that day, the children he'd met, the mistakes he'd made, and the father he hoped to become someday. He never intended to send the letters. They weren't for forgiveness. They were promises to himself. Then, one bright Saturday morning, as Daniel arranged tiny chairs into a reading circle before story hour, he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Mama, look." His heart stopped before he even turned around. Slowly, almost afraid to breathe, Daniel looked toward the library entrance. Standing just inside the doorway with a small backpack shaped like a ladybug was Emma. Beside her stood Olivia, her eyes meeting Daniel's across the room with an expression he couldn't quite read. It wasn't fear anymore. It wasn't anger either. It was cautious curiosity, as though she had spent months quietly watching the man he was becoming and had finally decided it was time to see whether that change was real. Daniel's hands tightened around the copy of The Little Bear's Promise he had been placing on the reading rug. Every instinct inside him urged him to rush across the room. But 6 months of therapy had taught him that love wasn't measured by how quickly you reach someone. It was measured by whether you respected the pace they needed. So he stayed exactly where he was. Emma looked up at her mother before taking a cautious step forward. "Hi, Mr. Daniel," she said shyly. Daniel smiled, his eyes already beginning to sting. "Hi, Emma." I'm glad you came today. She held up the library card clutched proudly in her tiny hand. Mama said I could borrow 3 books. Then we should find the very best 3, Daniel replied. Olivia remained silent during all that. 6 months ago, she never imagined herself taking Emma close to this man. However, the librarians, parents, and even Jessica were telling her all the time about this businessman who never missed any story hours, who stayed back to fix the torn books, who sat by the side of the scared children till they became happy again, and who did not ask for anything from anyone in return. This regularity of his behavior proved far more effective than any grand apology could have done. It had started healing her from inside. The story hour began a few minutes later, and almost 20 children lined up in a colorful semicircle, while their parents occupied the chairs behind them. Emma was a little hesitant about where she should sit, but then she went over to the other end of the rug where he was sitting, without touching him or leaning against him, just close enough that he could hear her excited breathing whenever the story became interesting. It was enough to make his chest ache with gratitude. As Daniel read about a little bear learning that families are built by showing up every day, he occasionally caught Olivia watching him instead of the book. She noticed how naturally he comforted a frightened toddler who began crying halfway through the story. She watched him patiently answer endless questions from curious children without ever losing his smile. There was no performance in it anymore, no audience he was trying to impress. This was simply who he had become. When the reading ended, the children scattered toward the shelves. Emma lingered beside Daniel, nervously twisting the straps of her little backpack. "Can I ask you something?" she whispered. Daniel knelt, so they were eye level. "You can ask me anything." She looked down at her shoes before speaking. "Mama says everybody makes mistakes." "She's right. Did you make a really big one?" Daniel's heart squeezed painfully. "Yes," he answered honestly. "The biggest mistake of my whole life." Emma considered that for several quiet seconds. "Did you say sorry?" "I did." "Did Mama forgive you?" Daniel glanced toward Olivia, who was pretending to examine a bookshelf while clearly listening. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "Sometimes forgiveness takes a long time." Emma nodded with the solemn wisdom only children seemed able to possess. "When I broke Mama's favorite flower pot, she didn't hug me right away either." Daniel laughed softly through the emotion gathering in his throat. "That sounds about right." Emma reached into her backpack and carefully pulled out a folded sheet of construction paper covered in colorful crayon drawings. "I made this at preschool." Daniel unfolded it with trembling fingers. It showed a little house beneath a bright yellow sun. 3 stick figures stood in front of it. One was clearly Olivia with long brown hair. One tiny figure wore a pink dress. The tallest figure had short brown hair and held both of their hands. Above them, written in uneven letters, were the words, "Maybe one day." Daniel stared at the drawing until his vision blurred. "It's beautiful," he whispered. Emma smiled shyly. "The teacher said families can grow." Before Daniel could answer, Olivia walked over and gently rested a hand on Emma's shoulder. "Sweetheart, why don't you go pick your last book while I talk to Daniel for a minute?" Emma nodded happily and skipped toward the picture book shelves. For a long moment, neither adult spoke. Finally, Olivia broke the silence. "She drew that last week," she said quietly. "She asked if people could become different after making bad choices." Daniel carefully folded the picture and held it as though it were made of glass. "What did you tell her?" Olivia looked toward Emma before answering. "I told her that real change isn't something people say. It's something they prove." Their eyes met. Months of pain, regret, disappointment, and quiet hope passed silently between them. "You've kept every promise you made," Olivia continued. "Not to me, to yourself." Daniel lowered his eyes. "I still have years of mistakes to make up for." "Maybe," Olivia said, "but you're finally walking in the right direction." She reached into her purse and handed him a small envelope. Inside was a photograph of Emma on her first day of preschool, missing her front tooth and grinning proudly beside a backpack nearly as large as she was. On the back, Olivia had written only one sentence. She asks if you'll come to her school reading day next Friday. Daniel read the words 3 times before looking back up, unable to speak. Olivia smiled faintly through tear-filled eyes. "It's just one afternoon," she said. "One step at a time." Daniel nodded, his own tears finally escaping. One step at a time. Emma came running back with 3 books hugged against her chest. Without thinking, she slipped her tiny hand into Daniel's as they walked together toward the checkout desk. It wasn't dramatic. There were no grand declarations, no miraculous reunion, no promise that everything would be easy from then on. There was simply the quiet start of a family finding their trust once more. And as Daniel gazed down at the small hand clasping his with such ease, he knew that redemption was never about making the past go away. It was about being brave enough, each and every day, to become who they deserve to be. In some cases, it's not the act of getting somebody back that is the victory. Sometimes the victory comes when you realize that there's a better version of yourself out there. In the case of Daniel, he found out that love isn't shown with promises, but with patience, truthfulness, and with the willingness to be there every day. Thank you very much for watching. If you found this story touching, leave a comment down below and tell us what you would have done if you were in Daniel's shoes. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification button so that you will never miss our next emotional story. Until then, take care.